Okay, students, welcome back. We're going to talk today about consumers, producers, and market efficiency. So, economists, when we look at market equilibria, we're particularly interested in whether or not the market seems to be working well for consumers and producers. And we assume at this point in time, because the market's competitive, there aren't other individuals, third parties, other than the consumer and producer. Those are the two primary parties that are affected by the transaction in the market. So this is our measure of social welfare. And by social welfare, what we mean is, are the resources being distributed in society in such a way that the consumers that are receiving the goods are getting a good value from them, and are the producers that are producing the goods able to produce them at a reasonable compensation? So ultimately what we're concerned about is that the consumers that get the good in some way really need and value the good, and that'll become a little bit more clear as we talk about it. We have a specific way of measuring the impact on consumers, but also we're interested in making sure that the costs of production are low. And really what that means is that we want to make sure that the low-cost producers are the ones that are producing the goods and services. Obviously, it would be a huge waste of resources if high-cost producers were the ones that were producing the goods and services that society was using. That would mean they're using up a bunch of resources unnecessarily. There's waste in the system. So we're trying to make sure the system is efficient, that there's no waste, and we're going to talk about how we measure that. This is an area generally called welfare economics, and it's going to occupy a lot of our attention. Basically, as we go through the course, we're going to find out that markets tend to be efficient and that specific government interventions can interfere with that efficiency, and we'll be concerned about identifying policies that cause problems for the way that resources are distributed in society. So the basic idea is that buyers and sellers, the reason that they transact voluntarily is because they're receiving some benefits from that. And ultimately, we'll learn that, again, when the market is competitive, that's important, that the equilibrium selected by the market is going to maximize the total sum of these benefits to buyers and sellers. This is actually kind of what Adam Smith meant when he talked about the invisible hand guiding markets. So let's get into it. So our basic idea is that when the market's competitive, that it's going to maximize the benefits to society from using it to distribute goods and services and produce those goods and services. So how do we measure the impact on consumers? Well, our measure is something we call consumer surplus. And consumer surplus is a little bit difficult to understand at first, but it's really that feeling that you get when you get a really good deal on something. So I don't know if you guys have had that experience or not, but you've walked into a store and something that you were getting ready to buy happened to be on sale. Well, what's really going on is that you were willing to pay more money than you had to get the good. And because of that, it's like somebody actually wrote you a check for the difference. It's the amount you didn't have to pay. And that's really how consumers end up getting value from participating in markets, because they don't have to negotiate every price they pay. They see a marked price and they can figure out if the item they want to purchase is a good deal. And if it's a good deal for them, then they're getting this type of unregistered income boost that we call consumer surplus. And producer surplus is a lot like profits. I would encourage you to think about producer surplus as being profit right now, even though it's not exactly profit. But it's the difference between what the seller receives from selling the product and their actual cost. So obviously, if they sell the good for more than it costs them, then they're receiving something that's going to add to their profits. So how do we actually begin to measure consumer surplus? Well, our first concept is willingness to pay. And actually, willingness to pay is, and it is sometimes called the maximum willingness to pay. It's the maximum amount that a buyer would be willing to pay for a good. And it measures how much the buyer values that good or service in terms of money. Consumer surplus is the buyer's willingness to pay for the good minus the amount that the buyer actually pays for it. So we can do a little example here. We can talk about 4 individuals who have different amounts of willingness to pay for a good. John is willing to pay 100, Paul is willing to pay 80, George is willing to pay 70, and Ringo is willing to pay 50. And so if you go ahead and you plot those individuals on a market demand curve, now we're going to assume that they're trying to purchase an album or something that would be measured in discrete units. So our demand curve is going to look a little bit different than the demand curves we've seen so far in class. And we actually talked about the difference between discrete and continuous goods a little bit. And apart from talking about consumer surplus and getting started, we're really not going to work with these sorts of discrete demand curves because they're kind of awkward. They look like stair steps, and that just makes our math a little bit more complicated than it needs to be to make all of the points that we want to. So we're going to say, well, if the price of the good was $100, then no one would want to buy it. At some price between 180, remember John has the willingness to pay of 100, so he would certainly be buying the first unit. And between 70 and 80, we would have 2 units because both John and Paul have a higher willingness to pay than George does, and his willingness to pay is 70. And remember, Ringo doesn't have a willingness to pay except for at 50 or less. So as the price drops, it's going to bring in these different consumers into the market, and it's going to bring them in the order of their willingness to pay. So we can go ahead and we can plot those points and the different quantities associated with them, and that gives us this kind of strange stair-step case demand curve. So now if we start to think about the idea of measuring the consumer surplus for these individuals and we give a specific price, then we can see, for example, the area that's underneath the demand curve and above a price of 80, it's going to bring in John as our first consumer for that first unit, and we have that light blue shaded rectangle, and that's going to be 1 unit across, and the difference between John's willingness to pay of 100 and the price he pays of 80 gives us the height, and so that's going to be a consumer surplus of $20. And then if we lower the price, we can see that we're going to bring in the next consumer. We have John's consumer surplus, which expands because now he's paying a lower price. His willingness to pay is still 100. But as we add in Paul, we can see that Paul is willing to pay 80. He only has to pay 70, and that adds $10 to our consumer surplus. So the total consumer surplus created at a price of 70 is that extra value that these 2 consumers get, and we can measure that as the area below the demand curve and above the price that they have to pay. So it's the area below the demand curve above the price that measures consumer surplus in the market. And so now we're going to deal with the demand curves that we're more used to, which are these continuous smooth demand curves. Likewise, we can pick a price and we can notice where the vertical intercept is on the vertical axis, and we can look at the quantity demanded. And now we have this triangle, which is consumer surplus, which still is the area below the demand curve above the price that consumers are being asked to pay, which is P1, and to the left of the quantity purchased. So if we do consumer surplus at a different price, there's our initial consumer surplus. If the price is lowered, then we're going to have this additional area that we capture. It's the additional consumer surplus to those initial consumers that are purchasing the first Q1 units, and some additional consumers get brought into the market because now the price has dropped beneath their willingness to pay, and they're getting some additional consumer surplus too, which is that dark blue triangle. And all of it together is the consumer surplus for all of the individuals. So what does consumer surplus actually measure? Well, again, it's the amount that buyers are willing to pay for the good minus the amount they actually pay for it. It measures the benefit that buyers receive from a good as the buyers themselves perceive it. So, and it's the buyers themselves perceiving it, because who determines the willingness to pay for a good except for the consumer themselves? Only you or I know how much a good is worth to us. Now, if we move on to producers, producer surplus is the amount that the seller is paid for a good minus the seller's cost. And it measures the benefit to sellers from participating in the market. Basically, like I said before, it's the amount that's adding to their profit as a result of each of the transactions that they undertake. So here we have 4 possible sellers, Mary, Frida, Georgina, and then Grandma. And notice that Grandma is the lowest cost producer, and Georgia is got a cost of $600, so she's a higher cost producer, and the highest cost producer is Mary at $900. So again, just as consumer surplus is related to the demand curve, producer surplus is really closely related to the supply curve. It's going to end up being the area above the supply curve and below the price that sellers receive. So now, if we're talking again about discrete units, we can see how many units are supplied at a bunch of different prices, and notice in particular that at a price of $500 or less, there's not going to be anybody in the market. And then right at $500, that's when our lowest cost producer jumps in. That's Grandma. And then as we raise the price, the other producers also join into the market. So here we go ahead and we see, again, because it's a discrete good, this kind of stair-step type, additional quantities, whole quantities coming into the market as the price increases. So using the supply curve, we can measure this producer surplus. Again, it's the area below the price and above the supply curve that measures the producer surplus in the market. So if we use our stair-step supply curve, and then we consider different prices, then we can measure, again, the difference between that price and the cost of producing. So here's Grandma's producer surplus. She's willing to sell the good, or her cost is $500. If she gets $600 for it, for that one unit, she's going to get an additional $100, which is her producer surplus, $100 above her cost. And now if we raise the price to $800, we can see again that Grandma would get additional producer surplus, and we would bring in an additional seller, and there would be some more producer surplus, and you can add those levels of producer surplus for the two producers together and get a total producer surplus at that price of $800. Okay, so likewise, most of the time we're going to be dealing with continuous supply curves, because that makes our math easier. And so we're going to pay attention to the points that represent our vertical intercept for our supply curve, and the price of the good, and the quantity supplied. So we end up again with this triangle, which are labeled with the points A, B, C. And now you can see that producer surplus is going to be the area of that triangle. It's the area above the supply curve and below the price that the sellers receive. So again, if we had an increase in price, there would be additional quantities that are provided. So we would move from Q1 to Q2. And as a result of that, we can see that there would be, again, this increase in producer surplus for existing producers, and you bring new producers into the market, and as a result of them coming to the market, there's an increase in producer surplus overall. So the next topic that we want to cover is producer efficiency, but we'll stop, overall market efficiency, but we'll stop here and continue later with that topic.